All right, let's try to keep this one short and sweet. 1990s start. Well, the era that we're talking about is going to start with the election of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was Democrat. He wasn't very popular, especially by the Republicans, because he won with only like 43% of the popular vote. Republicans didn't really see him as a legitimate president, and they were constantly looking for ways to try to bring him down. And he did a lot to really hurt himself. He was a scandal machine. We'll get to that one in a minute. But Bill Clinton is also president when there is a lot of social changes happening in the United States. One big change in particular was the gay rights movement was picking up a lot of steam, and it was having a lot of victories. One of the victories was the Don't Ask, Don't Tell movement, not movement, policy, Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the United States military. Up until this point, you could serve in the military as a homosexual, but you had to keep it quiet. And what Bill Clinton's policy was, or officially, you weren't allowed to serve in the military if you're gay. What the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was that you could serve, but you had to do it while being closeted. Also, because the gay rights movement was making a lot of gains in protecting its status, the Defense Against Marriage Act was passed, also been called DOMA, which was a response. And yeah, a lot of Democrats did support it. But that was because politics was different at that point. That was seen as a moderate position. The Defense of Marriage Act was the law that said that marriage was between one man and one woman. It is a very conservative reaction to the gay rights movement, and it did prevent same-sex marriages from being recognized outside of a particular home state. For example, in some states like New York, they had passed laws that allowed gay marriage, but DOMA prevented that marriage from being recognized in other states. There's issues with that. It's not just about being married; it's about things like receiving federal health care. It's about being able to visit a loved one when they're in the hospital. If there's rules that say only a spouse can visit. There's a lot of stuff happening there. There was also an attempt at healthcare reform in the 1990s. Hillary Clinton tried to head it up. It failed. We're going to see that the Democrats are going to come back to that in 2008, and it's going to succeed under Obama. The Clinton presidency is notable for its increased globalization, partially because of all the computers that were around we talked about in the last video. The idea of tariffs were no longer an economic not everybody believed it in the economic world. So there was this effort to get rid of tariffs. And in the 1990s, NAFTA was passed, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And this eliminated tariffs between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Economists argued that it would increase trade and boost the economy. Critics said that it would send manufacturing jobs to other countries. Economists rebutted with that, saying, yes, but those are low paying jobs. So you will not have a low paying job, but you will now be able to get a more high paying job because the country won't need those low paying jobs. This continues a trend that had been happening in the United States for a while, which was a move away from manufacturing jobs towards service and information industries. But as like these two folks here from middle America, probably lower class America, after NAFTA, the workers get the shafta. They're exporting jobs. So that was the fear. In 1994, 2 years after Clinton was elected, Republicans won a landslide midterm victory, and they controlled the House of Representatives, and I believe the Senate as well. So basically, they are in control of Congress. That forced Clinton to be less liberal with his policies because he wouldn't be able to get anything passed. So Clinton became more moderate and worked with the Republican Congress. The Republicans still weren't happy with that. They thought that they should be the ones in charge. So they tried to shut the government down a couple of times to try to force a balanced budget. Both times it failed, and both times the Republicans were the ones that were blamed for the shutdown. They thought that people would blame Clinton, and it didn't work that way. But because of the second term force that made Clinton moderate, we get this new economic thing that happens. Because the United States has this new computer tech-based economy, there is a boom. And Congress was forcing the country to reduce spending. And Clinton was able to get some taxes increased. All right. So you have reduced spending, economic boom, and increased taxes. And all of a sudden, all of those deficits the United States have been running in this red right here, This is the Reagan deficits, and this is the H.W. Bush deficits. And all of those are building onto that national debt that was 3 times what it was. Now, all of a sudden, in the 90s, under the Clinton administration, the deficit, the difference between how much is collected and how much is spent is going down, 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 to the point where, in 1998, there's a budget surplus. That budget surplus lasts 3 years. And guess what they did? They started paying down the national debt. Yeah. Whoop, what happened here? Uh-oh. Something's going to happen in 2000. We'll get back to it. All right. So this is sometimes referred to as the global economy, right? That you're the global economy. The bad side, the cons, is that a lot of outsourcing emerges, right? Because of new technology like the internet, long distance telephones, jobs that like customer service jobs, like when you call somebody and somebody picks up on the other line and helps answer your question, that doesn't have to be done in the United States where there's minimum wage laws now. That job might be done over in India, and you can see that on this cartoon here. So a lot of American corporations sent their jobs to other countries because they were cheaper, because they could be done cheaper. Economists argued, though, that consumers, because of this globalism, now has a wider variety of products that they can purchase, and the prices are cheaper. And then if you think about NAFTA, the economists argued that you'd get a better job because the United States could focus on those higher paying jobs rather than the low paying ones. And economists argued that this economy is going to provide you more options, cheaper prices, and a better wage. Some people agreed, some people didn't. Okay. Clinton was a scandal machine. Even before he was elected, he had some business dealings called the Whitewater Real Estate Plan. Excuse me. And it was pretty shady. He was also known to have affairs while in office. As governor, there was a bunch of people that accused him of extramarital affairs. And in 1994, when the Republicans took the House of Representatives, they set up an independent counsel, basically a lawyer that was going in and investigate all of these scandals, particularly the one dealing with the Whitewater business deal. And they just let him have free reign. He could look into whatever he wanted. And while he didn't find anything on the Whitewater scandal, he did start hearing rumors about an extramarital affair while Clinton was president. Because the investigator had all of these various powers, he actually subpoenaed Bill Clinton to talk about what Clinton thought was going to be the Whitewater investigation. And while he's in there, he asks Bill Clinton if he has had an affair with this intern named Monica Lewinsky. Bill Clinton lies under oath, commits perjury. And when the investigator, Ken Starr, takes that back to Congress, Congress says, "Aha! We have him now. He has committed high crimes and misdemeanors." And they impeached Bill Clinton for lying under oath, which technically was a crime. So when they got him, when they impeached him, the House of Representatives acts as the prosecution, and the Senate acts like a jury. And you need to get 2/3 of the Senate in order to convict or to find the president guilty of the impeachment and to remove him from office. And no Democrat voted for this. In fact, a couple of Republicans didn't vote to remove him either. And 45 people voted guilty, which means they didn't meet that threshold. But because no Democrats voted for this, it came off as very partisan when this divided Congress kept Clinton in office. So Clinton, even though he was paying down the debt, and even though the economy had boomed, it had entered into a slight recession going into the 2000s. And it was a very close election in 2000 between the Democratic candidate Al Gore, which was Clinton's vice president, and Republican George W. Bush, which was the previous president's son. And it came down to a very close election. In fact, Al Gore won the popular vote, but we don't elect the president based on who gets the most votes. We do it through the Electoral College. And it was going to come down to one state that was too close to call. That state was Florida. And Florida was an interesting case because the governor of Florida was George W. Bush's brother, not this guy, but Jeb Bush. And Initially, Florida was called for Democrats, and then after a little bit more counting, they called it for Republicans. And eventually, that night, it was thought that they initially reported, and the government initially thought that George W. Bush won Florida, but it was very close. It was within a few 100,000 votes, so it was triggered into a recount, and that became a hoopla. You get things like this guy here who is looking at handwritten ballots, and it was a whole thing. It was going to take time to look through all the ballots to get everything figured out. Um, Al Gore sued George W. Bush. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and a 5-4 conservative court decided, with the 5 conservatives making the majority decision, to stop the recount and just give George Bush the election. This made liberals very mad and thought that the Supreme Court had committed some conspiratorial act to give the conservative the election. Conservatives said that Bush would have won anyways, and this was just speeding things up. But this is going to lead to a lot of problems with the court later on. One way or another, George W. Bush was in office in 2011 when 9/11 happens and the United States was attacked by Al Qaeda, which starts the war on terror. Even prior to 9/11, George W. Bush was in office for a few months, and he had started to go back to that idea of supply side economics. Rather than keep the cuts and increase spending like under the Clinton administration, George W. Bush slashed taxes, trying to create that supply side economic stimulus. He hoped for economic growth. Cuts taxes. That budget surplus that was paying down the national debt is gone. We're back to budget deficits. And then 9/11 hits and the United States goes to war, which only increases the deficits. But they didn't increase taxes. In fact, George W. Bush told us to go and buy stuff. That would help the economy and would help out the war effort. So 2 things happened in 9/11. Number one, and the United States immediately went to war with Afghanistan because Afghanistan, under the Taliban, had given aid and comfort to Al Qaeda. Gave them a home base that they could attack from. And the United States passed the Patriot Act. So what is this war on terror? Well, the United States attacked the Taliban, trying to remove Afghanistan as a base from which Al Qaeda could attack. It doesn't work, and the United States left in 2021, 20 years after the war started. There was also a manhunt for Osama bin Laden, which they never found him. Not until the Obama administration, I think in 2011 or 12. So it took a while. The United States does get the Patriot Act out of this, though. So the United States goes to war and passes the Patriot Act. Now, what's the Patriot Act? First of all, it is an amazing acronym. Uniting and strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. That sounds very patriotic. But when you look at it, it is expanding the surveillance powers to wiretap American citizens, sometimes without a warrant. It's really awkward. And there's some anti-money laundering powers, which is a good thing. And there's more, but it is this idea of domestic surveillance increasing throughout the United States. The Bush Doctrine is the idea of preemptively striking against nations that were seen as potentially hostile to the United States. Well, why does that matter? Because that's what got the United States into the second Iraq War. So in 2001, the United States went to Afghanistan as a response to 9/11. But in 2003, the United States went to war with Iraq. That was a war of choice, not a war against Al Qaeda. So the United States said that Iraq was a terrorist sponsoring nation, and that because of that, they had gotten information that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction, heavily hinting that it was nuclear weapons that they were looking for. And they decided to invade to remove Saddam Hussein, remove the threat from the region and from the threat to the United States. When they got into Iraq, they didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, but they did quickly and easily defeat Saddam Hussein. The problem for the United States was not fighting against the Iraqis initially. It was what did they do once the war was over, because victory was easy, but creating a stable democratic government wasn't. It had to do a lot with religion. Islam is not a single religion. It's got denominations just like just like Christianity has. And Iraq has a pretty close Shia to Sunni, which are the two major denominations, population, and they don't really like each other. And the reason that that percentage exists is because when it was a colony, the Europeans didn't really care to figure out what the religions were. They just drew a line on a map. There's also some Kurds there as well, which is the Kurdish people are another group in the area that are not Sunni or Shia. It became a pretty big mess, and there was no easy way to create a democratic government that wasn't going to become oppressive to one side or the other. The United States stayed in Iraq until 2011, when it became seen as kind of a new Vietnam, that the United States was in a quagmire and they were just losing soldiers and couldn't know how to win. And eventually the United States just left. That was pretty embarrassing, the fact that it became a quagmire. And then in 2005, after the being reelected in 2004, Hurricane Katrina hits in New Orleans. George W. Bush was seen as being very ill prepared, unorganized. The areas that were hit hardest in New Orleans were black neighborhoods, so it was seen that he was not all that concerned with the problems of Black America. And then in 2006, in the midterm elections, Democrats took control of both houses. And when Congress is controlled by the opposition party, things get really hard for the president. And then in 2007, leading into 2008, right before the election, so probably about 6 months before the election in 2008, the economy just cratered, like the biggest economic recession since the Great Depression in 2008. And it was all caused by what's referred to as a housing bubble popped. The housing bubble, people were buying houses and the prices were just going up and up and up and up in 2000, throughout the 2000s. Partially that was because the government had relaxed some of the standards that the banks had to use in order to loan out these big loans to people. And it's pretty complicated. I'll try to explain it in class, but banks were giving out high risk loans to people and that means that loans that people might be able to pay, but they probably weren't going to be able to pay back. It wasn't a very secure loan. Mortgages are usually only given to people that they are sure are going to pay them back. But the banks started giving out these high risk loans, and then they started to worm these high risk loans into packages with other loans. And then once they could sell those off and get a quick profit. And then over time, they started making these packages that were almost all high risk loans. And then once all these high risk loans were out there being sold, when people were unable to pay those loans, all of a sudden banks didn't have any money. And once the banks didn't have the money, they were going to insurance companies that they had taken out in insurance on these loans, and the insurance companies ran out of money. And the economy cratered because these banks were failing, kind of like the bank runs we saw during the Great Depression. And the government, looking at the situation, said that these banks were too big to fail, meaning that they were so impactful on the economy that they didn't want to let those banks fail. So the government, the American government, took taxpayer money and bailed out those banks to the tune of $700 billion to these banks that knowingly got involved in these speculative activities, knowingly involved in risky behaviors, but the government bailed them out. The homeowners got nothing. The homeowners were told, you made a bad choice, you got to live with your decision. That made a lot of people really mad. And these, there's TANF, TANF. There's a couple of programs that were created under the Bush administration, which really drove up the national debt again. The Obama administration, when he's elected in 2008, is right in the middle of this housing market crash. He had to deal with this. The first 100 days or so while he was in office, he was trying to fix the economy. They passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It saved the auto industry, helped the banks, fixed the economy, got the economy going back in the right direction, but it was a slow recovery. It does drive up deficits. It did drive up the debt. While he was doing that, he was also trying to implement healthcare reform. Obama argued that the number one driver of the national debt was, especially as the baby boomers were aging, was the cost of healthcare. And they tried to get everybody on insurance through the Affordable Care Act. They had something called the individual mandate, which was pretty controversial at the time. They also tried to regulate Wall Street. And we're going to leave it at that. You can stop those slides and take a look as you want. Good luck.